Thanks so much for the generous introduction. Thanks so much for having me here. It's a real pleasure to finally visit. So this topic is, as Mark implied, I've been thinking about and writing about for many years. And went from being kind of this niche, interesting kind of discussion to something which is now the big thing that everyone talks about and thinks about. And so we'll give you my take on it, which I'm sure everyone here has had some of these thoughts before or read them before, but hopefully bear with me. Hopefully there's something new, different or new here, in addition to familiar ideas like the analogy with photography, which is everywhere these days. Just a slight bit about myself. A lot of my background is computer science. My research has been primarily computer science, and a lot of the work is in artistic, line drawing and painterly rendering. But I also have a BA double major in art, and so I do a lot of painting and drawing, just now as a hobby, but that's part of my background. And occasionally I have put these things together in my work. So this is an installation from 2001 that we showed at some art festivals in New York. That was from my PhD work in algorithms for making paintings from, in this case, video inputs. And so, as everyone knows, in the past 10 years, there's been this amazing whirlwind of art that has been somehow driven by or using or working with AI. I think I view the current epic as sort of beginning with Deep Dream in 2015, which was fun for 5 or 10 minutes, and neural style transfer became very popular as a filter very quickly. And then suddenly there's this brief period of people just playing with these tools and making new stuff with them. So making neural generated movie scripts and fake band names from examples and knitting patterns and so on. And this became, there was some effort to bring this into the art world. So this was an exhibition in San Francisco in 2016, sponsored by Google. There was an art exhibition based on Deep Dream and style transfer techniques. And it satirized the popular media. So this is from the satirical TV show Silicon Valley from May 2018.
I like it. It's really cool. So who painted it? A machine.
It's actually the first work of art made by AI to be sold in the 70s.
So, and then 6 months later, Christie's auctions for €500 million this GAN generated artwork, which is signed with the GAN loss function in the lower right corner. And then suddenly there's a whole lot of media energy around this. And then last year, things really changed with the development and widespread availability of text-to-image tools. And now everyone is talking about AI tools as you type in text and an image comes out. With this previous way of work, the computer scientists who were writing about this did things like this creative adversarial network, which I think is a really nice paper, but I find the abstract quite strong. They say, we propose a new system for generating art. The system generates art by looking at art and learning about style and becomes creative. So there's fairly strong usage of these words that we associate with human creation. This is immediately directly picked up by the media. So New Scientist headline, artificially intelligent painters invent new styles of art. AI artist creates his own painting style and critics prefer its work to human efforts. So here's an actual, prominent art critic, Jerry Saltz, commenting on this work. And let's see both what he says, but also how he views the role of the algorithm in this process.
Initial thoughts, incredibly dull, generic, boring. The programmers are not freeing up the program. I want the robot to tap into its inner robot. Be free.
So it's a little unclear how serious this is, but it might be. Maybe he actually thinks the robot has just not been trained to, been set free to do its own artwork well. So this topic comes up over and over again. Can computers create art? Can they be artists? And sometimes that people I talk to say it's just a matter of, are they good enough? Do we have enough GPUs or something? Obviously they could be artists. Other people I've talked to say the opposite. Of course, making art requires intent or expression or something like that. And those seem like almost religious concepts to me. It'd be nice to have a more, concrete discussion about that. Than this, I think there's an intuition that art is a purely human thing, but what does it actually mean? And so there are sort of 4 main points I want to make in this talk. The first is that I believe that these, quote, AI software systems that really are just tools for people to make art in a bunch of different ways. Second, that computers cannot be considered themselves artists, and for reasons I'll get into, and I don't think it's likely that this is going to change, although there are ways that it could. But the way that we make and understand art is going to change, often in some ways very profoundly. and that there are a lot of historical analogies that provide really useful lessons in understanding these changes. So much of the discourse these days is either AI is democratizing art and making it available to everyone, making everyone to be creative, or it is killing art or putting artists out of work. And I think these extremes are really unfortunate, and the actual effects of these things are complex and very multifaceted, and history provides a useful guide for understanding these changes. So, looking through some of these analogies, we sort of tend to view art as this thing which has always been static, and yet it has really transformed throughout history. So, for example, the development of oil paint by Van Eyck really changed the ability of painters to use realistic tones and deeper shades, as well as making the practice more practical. Michelangelo, according to Hockney, looked down at oil paint, and he said oil paint is for amateurs, and people who aren't very good. Within the Western tradition in the following centuries, one thread of realist painters got more and more skilled at really depicting reality in a visually expressive way. And I think for us, we're all surrounded by photography in our daily lives, and images and magazines and web and everything. And I think it's sort of hard to appreciate just how special it must have been to appreciate these things in a gallery or in someone's house, that the only way you could have a picture like this is if someone who is highly skilled and trained had made it. And so the identity of what an artist is and what an artist can do was, for painters, very closely tied to this ability to mimic reality. So the threat came obviously from photography. So this is the earliest known photographic style image. Of course, as people were just in the beginning just playing around with it, tinkering it, just see what could it do. So of course they had to Instagram their meals. This is the first known photograph that has a person in it, because it's I want to say 10-minute exposure or 30-minute. Anyone who's walking by the street will have been blurred out, but this fellow here seems to be having his shoes shined. So he was standing still for long enough to be captured in the exposure. Here's the first selfie, 1838. But the first real public awareness of the threat came in 1838 when Daguerre publicly announced and described his invention. And because the French government viewed this as potentially valuable for society, he didn't patent it, they bought him out. And immediately with his initial presentation, the classical painter Paul Delaroche supposedly said, "From today, painting is dead. Here's a machine that does what artists do." Turner said, "This is the end of art. I am glad I have had my day." So from the point of view of what an artist is in the 19th century, this is a machine that automates that. So what actually happened? Well, as I mentioned before, the effects can be complicated. So there's different effects in different sort of domains. So portraiture is one place where if you were very wealthy, you could hire someone to make a picture of you, because people want to have pictures of themselves or their family and friends. If you're not so wealthy, you might have a silhouette made, so you just get your profile in this. It's not a great likeness. And so within a few decades, a lot of portrait painters had to change to being photographers, or they were put out of work. So even because these are long exposures, you have to sit, clasping the chair tight with your head in a brace, so you don't move. There's no motion blur, and yet now we have this incredible set of photographs of 19th century figures, like the photographer Matthew Brady here, that as a result of this technology coming around. So some painters objected. So one painter photographer wrote that photography has harmed painting considerably and killed portraiture, once the livelihood of the artist. So this is one way that painters made a living, and they lost work as a result of it, or they had to learn the new technology. Within the more high art domain, there was a debate: is photography art? Again, the initial people experimenting with technology are just tinkering around, playing with it, trying to see what happens when you make pictures with this new technology. Within any new art form, there's always the effort to justify, to rationalize it by mimicking traditional art forms. So there's a movement called pictorialism, where they would create photographs here composed of multiple exposures in the style of a lot of classical paintings. So for example, here's a David painting, which is a sort of horizontal tableau, and the same sort of style and technique is used to illustrate, notions of death in the photograph on the right. And as painting became more abstract in the 19th century, or more atmospheric, so did the pictorialist photographers as well. And by the beginning of the 20th century, photography came to be accepted as an art form, as being shown in major galleries and museums as a result of many years of societies and journals and so on. And so now we really see it as its own art form. On the other hand, there were the haters, like the poet Charles Baudelaire, who wrote in a review of a photography salon, if photography is allowed to stand in for art, it will corrupt it completely, thanks to the stupidity of the multitude. So presumably that's all of us with our cell phones. But the artists themselves reacted to this provocation. So for example, Whistler wrote, an imitator is a poor kind of creature. The man who paints only the surface he sees before him, if you were an artist, the king of artists would be the photographer. So now he's saying that just making things look real is not art. And in fact, Van Gogh wrote in his pivotal year in '88 to his brother, accurate drawing is not the thing to aim at because the reflection of reality in a mirror it would not be a picture at all, no more than a photograph. So now the artists are saying, actually making things look real isn't art at all, it's something different. And then within a few decades, now this was all the past tense. So in a statement on Dada, Breton wrote that photography dealt a mortal blow to the old modes of painting. Since this thing assured artists of achieving what they had set themselves up as their goal, now they aspire to break free of the imitation appearances. So in short, what happened with this technology was, at first, it seems like it automates what artists do. And the artists were afraid of it. They said it was bad. It was going to make art worse. What actually happened is we have this new art form called photography, which is quite different than painting in a lot of ways. The old art form was really not invigorated, but also transformed. I would argue that one of the many causes of the modern art movement was photography. Who knows, if we didn't have photography, maybe we wouldn't have modern art, or we would have had it in a very different form. A lot of work was affected, so people who made portraits for a living were put out of work, or they had to learn new skills. And also, we now all carry smartphones with us, with cameras. And so by the 20th century, people who were not professionally trained could make realistic pictures by taking pictures with cameras. And that has also really changed the world. So there's a whole bunch of different things here, different effects at different time scales and different communities, and a lot of these trends repeat with different artistic technologies. And I'll mention others along the way in this talk that have repeated some of these trends in different ways and at different times. So in results of the modern art movement, there's different ways of expressing it, this institutional theory of art, institutional historical. But just to simplify, I'll just say whatever an artist does can be art. That we have a very, very broad notion of what could be art. And different people say different things about this, but for me, and for the purpose of this talk, I want to say it's almost anything. Painting, conceptual art, music, dance, video games, movies, all of these things in some way or some communities view them as forms of art. And I think it's worthwhile thinking of them in a general context. But within the conceptual or modern art trend, one of the important developers of conceptual art beyond Duchamp was Sol LeWitt, and he's particularly significant for thinking about computer art because he would write down instructions for how to make these paintings. And the set of instructions say where to draw lines, which colors to fill things in. And for his work, the artist is the person who gives the instructions, not the person who executes it. So it's a lot like generative computer art. And he wrote quite a lot about how here the artist is the person giving the instructions. The artwork the idea is a machine that generates the art. So as soon as people could make pictures with computers, they started doing it. So in the 1960s, there was a bunch of experiments with people making generative art. The first one is inspired by similar work by Mondrian. And this is before we had programming languages, before we had code or terminals. And people I don't know, I imagine plugging in wires or flipping switches manually. They're experimenting with this new technology and seeing what it can do. One of the most significant AI artists of the 20th century is Harold Cohen. He started out conceptually trained from Goldsmiths, and his original technique was he would give himself simple instructions to follow that he would then paint on paper. Then he discovered programming in the 1970s with Fortran, and he just said, well, why am I doing it myself? I can have the computer do it. And he spent the remaining decades of his life building more and more sophisticated computer algorithms that would generate paintings. And many of his works were collected by major museums and galleries. And we'll come back to him a little bit more later. So there's a whole history of people, as computers get more and more, have more technological power, people do more interesting artworks with them. Digital painting came along in the 1980s. One important set of works, I think, for looking back, is evolutionary artworks by people like Carl Sims and Scott Draves, who would define procedural classes of elements in a population. And then they'd get feedback from people, which one do you like, do you not like, and they would evolve these things through genetic algorithms. And I really liked Scott Draves' screensavers. Like each day it would have like a different screensaver that's even more dazzling than the last. Computer animation is in the place where people on the outside tend to think the computer just did everything. When you actually learn the history of how Pixar got started and how they started working, it really was a very tight collaboration of artists and scientists. Before they put artists together with scientists, it was like computer animation was just like a bunch of novelties and fun tricks. And they would, before founding Pixar, Ed Catmull and L.V. Ray Smith, they would go down to Disney and try to convince them to adopt computer technology in animation, and the animators were frightened of the computer. They felt it was going to take their jobs away, and they spent a lot of time trying to tell people it's not just a tool, it's not a tool, it's just a tool, it doesn't do the creativity. And in fact, if you've ever tried to use conventional computer animation tools, you know it's very labor intensive and skill intensive. A lot of the skills involved of performance and acting through animation are very much the same as what they are with traditional hand-drawn animation. And now if we look through almost any animated film, they employ hundreds of people doing all sorts of jobs. And even things that we call live action, or at least get categorized as live action films, like Avengers movies, have tons and tons of computer animators employed as well. My own work, as I mentioned, I had an art double major with computer science, and my PhD work was in making these kinds of painting algorithms. So my first work, I started with a photograph, and I wrote a bunch of code that determines where to place brush strokes as a function of the photograph. And so there was implementing my intuitions and experience about how you place brush strokes. And this led to the installation I showed earlier. That was all explicit procedural code, but it's very hard to author artistic style that way, so I thought maybe I can use examples. So I developed a system that takes a painting, or in this case a pastel illustration, a photograph as input, and generates an illustration in that style. And even though it's in some way based on the training data, I can also tell you, or you can read the paper and see exactly every step of that, how that works. There's no magic involved except what emerges from the processing of the algorithm. One of my favorite AI artists is Helena Sarin, and she talks about how she makes the analogy with watercolor. So if you've ever tried to paint it with watercolor, you want to control it, and it doesn't quite want to be controlled. It feels like it has a mind of its own. And she describes using GANs in a similar way, that you have to don't fight it, just let the medium do it. Throughout all this history of people finding new ways to make art with computers, there's always the initial reaction is, computer art, is it really art from 1986? Within the past year now, we have headlines in the Wall Street Journal, is it art if it's made by AI? But is it art? It's just like never ending. And so the common thread here is we have more than 50 years of people making art with computers. People ask, is it really art if it's made by a computer? Can AI be artists? And yet in all this time, these are pieces of code that people wrote, artists use in various different ways. And none of that, I think, has really changed. And so, as a short, I think all this art is human-made in some way or another. We're also living a time of just enormous hype. This hype itself is not new. Whoops. With the announcement of the perceptron in 1958 by Larry Rosenblatt, the Navy announces that it has a computer it expects will be able to walk, talk, see, write, reproduce itself, and be conscious of its existence. And this is based on a linear classifier, perceptron. This is before they had gradient descent. This is just adding a list of numbers and comparing it with a threshold. So this is like, the hype is the same, it's just the technology is catching up. We have, like I said before, painters invent their own styles of art, computer design this great magazine cover, and so on. You're all familiar with it, I'm sure. So, and I think part of this thing is this word AI. When we talk about, what does AI mean to most of us? We learn it from movies and video games and television. AI basically means these things that are almost human, but just a little emotionally stunted or psychopathic. This is what AI means to most of us. And so when we say AI algorithms, this is what I think most people in the public associate that with. When in fact, really, it's data fitting. Nearly all of the algorithms that are popular these days are fitting high-dimensional functions to large data sets with large compute processing. But it's basically stats 101 turbocharged with some wrapper code around it. And we as humans have a very strong propensity to infer intentionality and emotion and agency with artificial processes we don't understand. Our ancestors would imbue spirits in the trees and the clouds in the sky. The ELIZA effect, I think, is a really strong example, if you're not familiar with this. This is a piece of code that Joseph Weizenbaum wrote in the 60s to parody talk therapy. It's very simple procedures that say, it's asking these very generic questions, and the first time he showed it to someone, they got emotionally involved with it. They thought it was like a real therapist, and we're just doing this on a much bigger scale now. And as I'm sure you're all aware, there are lots of harmful consequences of giving AI algorithms agency over our own lives. I live in San Francisco, where in my neighborhood every day I see cars driving around without drivers, and they essentially have no regulatory oversight, or there is, but it's kind of broken right now. So they can run red lights and break laws, and there's no direct accountability. So I think that actually saying that computers are artists has the danger of supporting this idea of AI ascensions and AI autonomy, that these things are anything more than large data fitting procedures. And I think humans should have ownership and responsibility of artwork and other places where these pieces of code are making decisions in our lives. And there are many harms to not doing so. So all of that is a discussion of the present world we live in and maybe the near future. But there's still a possibility that within some number of decades from now, that might change, and we might eventually consider computers to be artists. And I think this is a really hard thing it's worth thinking about, and it's hard to make predictions about and think about when it can change. How do you even pose the question?
Can a robot write a symphony? Can a robot turn a canvas into a beautiful masterpiece? Can you?
And before I get to the actual, my phrasing of that question, I want to mention a few other things that often come up in this discussion. And I also want to say, I want to make a prediction here. When will people accept computers as artists, or how will we change? Will that perception change? And I want to acknowledge that making specific predictions is very hard. If we went back in history 60 years and asked people, what will the city of the year 2001 look like? They might say, well, we'll be driving to work in our moon buggies and our space domes. And if you ask people 60 years ago, what will the computer of the future look like, the year 2001, they'll say, well, a computer might fit in a room of your house. And so we get a lot of these things wrong. But I think we can still forecast based on trends and these historical patterns. So, right now, of course, we have all these AI hype predictions that are just completely ridiculous. So, one thing I often hear, and that we see implicitly, is that being an artist is just a matter of making good pictures. That this piece of code made a nice picture, and so, of course, artists are obsolete. And I think it's worth going back to Harold Cohen, because there's this thought process a lot of us go through, that I've gone through, of I made some code that makes a picture, does that make it the artist? So let's see the process he went through. And I'm sorry the audio will be a little garbled, but the text is down here, I hope you can read it.
10 years after that, I would have said, look, the program is doing this on its own. 10 years on, and I would have said, the fact that the program is doing this on its own is the central issue here. Quality. And I could have had it go on forever without rewriting a single line of code. How much more autonomous than that can one get?
So he's writing code, it's making these artworks, it's being shown in galleries and museums and getting recognition. Does that make it an artist?
Well, of course, that's exactly the point. It's virtually impossible to imagine a human being in a similar position. The human artist is modified in the act of making art. For the program to have been similarly self-modified would have required not merely that it be capable of assessing its own output, but that it had its own modifiable worldview to provide a basis for any meaningful assessment.
So this is an experience a lot of us have had of, I made a computer that generates images, maybe it's an artist. But then if you contemplate it, you think, well, you know, it's kind of missing something. It's predictable. It's kind of just doing the same thing that I authored. And so his answer is, what if it could grow and have its own worldview? Maybe that would make it an artist. And so I kind of call these attribute theories of art. You say, you try to list in advance what makes an artist what they are, that they make work that's creative or surprising and good and so on. And then, or in his case, it can grow and has a worldview. And maybe that makes it an artist. And I think in all these cases still, you have a piece of code that you wrote and you design it to have these procedures, these properties, and then the computer is following the instruction precisely that you gave it. And I never find that satisfying as thinking of this thing as an artist. And moreover, we already have systems that could do almost any, of these high-level attributes you can think of. So some people say that art algorithms should make work that is original or surprising and good, and we have that. So for example, here's an animation generated by procedural algorithm that you can watch for a long time, and it's just kind of like dazzling. Whether or not you consider it beautiful or not, I think it's definitely impressive and surprising. A lot of people really enjoyed it when it came out, and it can go on for a long time making things that you've never seen before, and it can be described in 10 lines of code. It's a Mandelbrot set, which was very popular in the 80s. And chaos theory tells us it is not predictable. You can't tell what it's going to do in the future, so it's sort of naturally surprising. Eventually, you get the point, and it's kind of boring after a while. But it does satisfy this criteria in some sense. There's a really nice paper in Science in 1999 where they essentially describe a very simple procedure they could go through without even computers involved, that like just applying this rote procedure, they can make advertising pitches that professionals would rate as being, quote, creative. Now with text to image, we have these systems that, like, when I first played with this thing and type in some text and generate images out, I'm like, oh my gosh, this is a better artist than I am. In fact, on some level, it's like a better artist than anyone is. Nobody could generate images this fast and with this range of styles and content, within milliseconds. That like nobody can do this on some level. But it's also, these algorithms are just matrix multiplication and thresholding. Once you fit the data, it's just adding and multiplying numbers and comparing them with zero. That's all it is. It's following a set of instructions. And so, despite technical skill, I find it very hard to accept that as itself an artist. As I mentioned before, some people view intent and expression as being core to making art. It's kind of a modern art era kind of notion that art requires intent or expression, but obviously it's easy to automate these things, to write code that generates some kind of purpose or expression of the work, and then generates something that has those emotions or something. When most often I give this talk for computer scientists, and one thing I often hear is, aren't we all just computers? And the key point I want to make, which I'm going to say more about later, is that we are people and computers are not people. And that's, I think, an important distinction. I feel like, at least with there's always one person at least with the computer science audience, is kind of like, doesn't really buy this as a justification. And I just want to say, like, we don't know what the difference is. It's not like we can just, oh yeah, we know how to code up people, or that everything's automatically equivalent. And I give morality as an example, that like, it's okay to like, wipe your computer, turn it off, and recycle it or throw it away. Not morally okay to kill people. And I feel like that's an important distinction. Another thing that I hear, again, when I presented this to computer scientists, well, twice before I had this slide, somebody raised their hand and said, well, you just have to look up the definition of art, and that will tell you the answer to all these questions. I imagine you're not thinking that, but I'll just say that, when people attempt to define art, they are attempting to describe current practices. They're attempting to say, like, why is theater art and sports they're not able to make predictions about things we haven't seen before, especially types of artists we haven't seen before. And here I'm really trying to predict what can be an artist. We have so little, as it were, training data about that. So I want to come back to this idea of whatever an artist does can be art. So really the question is, what can be an artist? And I want to propose a theory or a hypothesis that art is a social behavior. I really believe that art is very much a product of our social nature as humans. And by social behaviors, I think of things like conversation, gifts, marriage, sports, fashion. And these are all things that, of course, have multiple roles or functions. So like fashion, we wear clothes in order to protect our bodies from the elements, but we choose which clothes we wear as a function of our social relationships and how we want to be seen and how we want to present ourselves and so on. So these things, and I think art is a similar thing. Art is something that we share with other people, family, friends, society. We go and see other people's art, we talk about it with other people, we buy it, sometimes very publicly, and we display it in order to display our values and our wealth, perhaps. We also teach it and communicate our values through teaching art. And I'm very persuaded by the idea that art is an evolutionary adaptation. There's this lovely book called The Art Instinct that I find very persuasive. And he essentially argues that art is part of our evolutionary history. It has these evolutionary functions, such as essentially strengthening social ties and social roles. So it has gifts for sharing, for displays of status, for mating, and so on. And these are all things that are functions of our social history. They're all part of our social nature as animals. Now, sometimes when I give this talk, also someone says, well, I just make art for myself. Doesn't that disprove this whole theory? And I think that's great. Like, I personally feel like I get a lot of value out of the drawing I make, even though nobody pays me for it. But that still doesn't disprove the evolutionary history of it. Lots of our evolved behaviors end up being pleasurable or beneficial for their own sake. Like, I would say that we speak and talk for the purpose of communication with other people. Now, you might talk to yourself or sing in the shower on your own. That doesn't mean that there's not this social origin of speech. So in short, when we think about whether computers can be artists, I think we care about people. We care about our social relationships. We care about art because people make it. And computers, again, I think are not people. And so it doesn't make sense to think of computers as artists because we just don't care about their social relationships or who they are as people. And I think one interesting point of comparison are natural processes, things like beaches and flowers and the night sky, things that can have a lot of similar effects on us that art traditionally has, and yet we don't really view it within the same domain as art. It's really something quite different in a lot of ways because it was not made by a person or people. So with that hypothesis or theory, here are my predictions about when a computer could be an artist. If we ever develop conscious human-level AI, then of course, by definition, these things could be artists. But this is pure science fiction. It's something that might never happen. Maybe we'll never know how to do this. Maybe it's 10, 50 years out, but it is almost completely unrelated to the technology we have now. It's just so far from the world we live in. Now, as I indicated, like things like Eliza and Alexa, Siri Cortana, Pero Therapeutic Seals, Neko Itsume, there's all these sort of like quasi-social interactions we have with agents. And people can, if they don't know how it works, especially, come to feel an emotional connection with it. But then when they learn what is actually under the hood of the system, then they feel a little cheated. So I think it's possible these things can be viewed as artists as long as there's some deception going on as to the nature of what the quote AI is. And finally, with these pieces of code, you like git pull some repo and it produces pictures. I just don't see how we could call these things artists as long as we understand what they are and how they work. But that being said, as I mentioned before, I think that these new technologies are going to transform the way we understand art in ways that are complex and hard to predict and hard to tease apart. So, here's Les Paul, who is the main innovator of the electric solid body guitar in the 1940s, and he played these lovely jazz and swing tunes. I don't see how he or anyone else could have predicted how his invention was going to just transform culture and transform music. It's the same for these new things right now. We don't just don't know what the precise changes are going to be. Another interesting example, so in the 1920s, in the 1900s when recorded music was first invented and made commercial, performance musicians argued against it and campaigned against it because it was going to put performers out of work. And this is from an advertising campaign in the 1920s, in 1927 after the talkies, when movie films were able to have audio soundtracks, and the performance musicians campaigned against it because it's bad to have recorded music to go along with a movie. They should have a live performer in the movie theater. And again, these performance musicians in the late 20s lost work because they were replaced by recorded soundtracks for movies. And obviously, as we know, now the soundtrack is such an integral part of a movie. It's just such a different art form now that we have sound in movies. Moreover, recorded music, of course, is very different from music that came before. One example is development of hip hop, which is something that, again, it has many cultural factors. But one of the important pieces for hip hop was this technology of having recorded music on two turntables and a fader and a microphone, and suddenly, like one or two guys with one or two people with this technology could make music, and they made art which is really different than anything that came before that was enabled and created by this technology. So based on these historical trends, I have a bunch of predictions broadly to make, which may seem obvious. One thing is that these future AI tools are not going to look like today's tools. Right now, so much of the blah 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 is around text to image, but that's not what people are going to be using 2 years from now. Even within the past year, people were already saying, okay, how do we add spatial control and editing and hole filling and all these other different, more direct manipulations to text to image. And many other things are going to be provide more detailed affordances to artists who want to have fine-grained control over the artworks they create. Artists, I believe, are really going to find great ways to use these tools, and new styles and genres and techniques will emerge, and we cannot predict exactly what those things are going to look like. They're going to be things that come about from this artistic process of exploration and creativity. More people are going to be able to create and communicate in ways that they couldn't have before. You want to share a meme or a greeting card with a friend, you don't have to just buy one that's off the shelf, or you don't have to be skilled as an artist, you can just have something semi-automatically generated. There will be disruptions to artistic labor markets. There are certain kinds of work that will disappear or lose a lot of work or be transformed in various ways. Especially, I feel like the most obvious place is kind of the lowest end of work for hire, illustration, and design, things that are it doesn't have to be that creative, it just has to fill a role. There become many difficult ethical challenges, which I haven't really alluded to here that much, but I'm sure you're all aware of. Are people harmed by these technologies, and how do we trade that off against their potential benefits? But I always definitely believe that good art will always be hard to make and will always need artists. As long as the bar can be raised with technical skill, then artists are always pushed to doing something much more than what you could have done the easy way. And I think we're going to rethink very much, again, what art is, just the way we thought what it was with the invention of photography over 100 years ago. And with that, I just want to conclude with two readings that are sort of this talk, but based on this paper I wrote 5 years ago, and some of this is some of it may be a little bit outdated, but I think a lot of the same ideas are there. And then I have a blog post that includes a lot of more recent stuff, which I haven't figured out how to publish it, so I'd be interested to have any feedback or suggestions on that. So thank you. to take any questions.
I had a question. One of your premises was that we appreciate the art because it was made by people. But for a lot of forms of art, we just appreciate for the enjoyment it brings us itself, and it doesn't matter whether, like, who made it, right? And so the thing that's new about AI, unlike photography and video and any other technologies that can actually create these things that are novel, on very small prompts, right? The input work to output is just a different order of magnitude in terms of what it generates. So you can generate stories and things like that, and if people enjoy this, like a novel, if it outputs novels that people enjoy, it doesn't matter if it was written by a person or not, right?
Well, I mean,
not art. I mean, I don't know.
Yeah, I would say that where it came from is a big part of how we appreciate it. Like imagine a tree that grew in the forest and a tree next to it that's essentially identical that had been sculpted by a person methodically, and you would experience those things in very, very different ways. Just knowing the difference that a person made this one and start wondering like why did they make it and what was the skill involved. I think definitely there's lots of reasons why we would appreciate.
I mean, there's some value to that. Like people appreciate handmade sweaters, and there's value that somebody actually made it manually. But that's a niche market where most people just care about clothes that like I just want to look good or it fits me well, and I don't care if it's factory made. So like there's always the bulk masses would just appreciate good content and good stuff that fits and it's cheap. And that's what the AI systems will be able to produce. Like you said, the lower end first. And what I worry is that it'll displace, because artists, in order to be the real skilled creative types, you usually work your way up. Nobody starts being the innovator from the beginning. It's really hard. You have to start somewhere. And even these famous painters, they often started doing portraits and doing, like Picasso was just a portrait. They did traditional stuff first, and then they got really good at it, and they started diverging. If that lower tier is removed, how could artists progress to do more creative stuff? Because AI is doing everything from the bottom. Like it just seems like people will just gravitate to generating content. It's cheaper, it's faster.
Yeah, so there's definitely a question of the health of the ecosystem. Like, is there a social and commercial structures that support and help artists grow and develop? So that's a big question. Like my understanding is like it's a very precarious job.
That's why I feel like it's challenging art, not because like it's going to replace them, but because they'll become basically extinct from a functioning capacity. Like you need to start at the bottom and work your way up and learn the trade, and it's going to be harder to do that with these technologies unless you're doing something else.
I mean, I think so. With respect to the past, like as long as the social structures are there, I think you definitely work your. I mean, again, making predictions, but I imagine that there will be one will work their way up using these tools. Like you start out like, I don't know, doing text to image to make like greeting cards or something, and then as you get better and better, you're doing more of the manipulation and modification yourself to the point where you're like actually the tool is just very low, small part of your process, or you're like much more the conductor orchestrating how these tools get work in ways that unskilled or people who don't have the same skill just using the tool naively wouldn't have. And it may be that the nature of that process of making that final artwork is really different than it is today, but there could still be a process or a path from naively using the tools, just like the text prompts, to using them in very original ways that no one's seen before.
Thanks for the really interesting talk. I assigned that reading in one of my classes, the 2018 piece, so looking forward to reading the later blog post. I really appreciate you bringing up these examples of like moral distinctions and how it's permissible to treat automated machines, computers, and people. Because one thing that brings to mind for me is, in addition to the ways in which these technologies are going to possibly change the ways in which we make art, the present reality of how they are impacting how people who are involved in making art are being treated in ways that like seem to bring some of the things that are permissible to do to computers onto people, like have an expectation of increased output without comparable compensation or adequate rest. Like the Spider-Man credits you provided are really suggestive to me, because with Spider-Man 2, they had massive issues with labor conditions for the special effects teams and animators working on it. And like it's difficult to draw direct connections, but there's definitely a relationship between the increased, I'm going to use creative in the sense of like output of these technologies and the expectations and impacts that apply to human laborers, where there's just like the people who are cleaning data for some of this stuff. And so this is just a roundabout way of like me getting at, like, you're someone who's in between this space of looking at how these technologies are reshaping how we think about art, and you're also a computer scientist who builds tools for artists and builds tools for making art. So from like a moral or ethical standpoint, what responsibility do computer scientists have to think about these types of impacts, or how do you think about it in your work?
Yeah, so those are great points. I agree with all those points. I think, yeah, I feel like the responsibility of computer scientists, that's been a hot topic in the past few years, and I sort of struggle with that. Like, I don't know where I'd land in a lot of the specific details of these issues. I think for me, the thing which seems clearest to me as the role of computer scientists is to at least discuss these things and write about these things that are not harmful. And I certainly see other places, like, I review a paper and they say our algorithm is creative and like it beats computer artists, human artists, and like I feel like just even the discussion around what they've actually built, I think needs to change. And when people are actually deploying things, then there's also a debate there. And again, I don't. I feel lucky that I'm not, forced to make those choices myself. With respect to the thing you mentioned before, like I guess, and also the previous comment, I just want to say, like, kind of my message here a little bit is sort of twofold. That there's sort of two topics. There's like how do computers function as artistic tools, and then there's the societal impacts. And I hear people arguing against AI art and the people who are fighting for their jobs, saying this is not art, it's like bad, it's replacing people. And I want to say, like, there needs to be more nuanced arguments against the adoption of these tools. One book, by the way, I really liked on the topic was Choke Point Capitalism by Cory Doctorow and Rebecca Kipling. That talks about how these technologies enable market forces that push artists out. As far ethical roles beyond that, that's a broad question. Maybe it's hard to answer that in the abstract.
One of the important points you're making in the latest paper, of course, is also the big questions that are now being finally debated in an eloquent way. There is no clear resolution yet, and it won't be, and it's going to be different from the different legal system standpoint, is of course the actual material that the models are built upon, right? Because from the also large language models, from the standpoint of from the capitalist standpoint, these models are actually built on stolen material, right? They learn from, large language models learn from 2,000 years at least of human language creativity that is in one way or the other recorded. So how do you, the fact that these systems are just out there and that they're going to create, because we haven't seen the monetization yet of that, right? You can just go create an account and you use the systems, but that moment will come. The piper will come and you'll have to pay it. And that's going to be a very, very large debate, because it's leading into this kind of new feudalist model where essentially creativity is downgraded, it's not paid, the rights are not compensated, and the large models are just, using 2,000 years of human creativity without any, and these companies are essentially going to try to monetize this, but they have stolen.
But
one way or the other.
Don't artists do the same thing?
No.
Every artist, I know many artists who's never seen anything before and just creates new stuff without ever seeing anything.
No,
Like
it's not the same thing. You cannot. There's a legal system that is in place that is
Like,
historical. That
filmmakers watch tons of films and they learn how films from other films. They learn.
Yeah, learn from,
Yeah.
not
This is what these
No,
things are doing.
no, because it's quantified. You see, the method is different.
Really?
Yeah, absolutely. You actually take material, you algorithmize it, or however, you basically take a large data set and that you did not create, and you essentially use specific algorithms on it, and the person who created that data set is not compensated. There is a problem.
Like Tarantino watched all the films that came before, changed weights in his brain, and then
No,
he
if you think that that's how Tarantino created, then you don't understand how Tarantino created these films. That's a big problem. He didn't create it by just parsing the history of cinema.
No, parsing is wrong.
And-
He studied, he became a student
Yeah,
of
but-
every film. And
So are you?
everything.
Yeah, exactly. So
Had he not done that, that
So
would
the
have
large
been-
models are not studying. They're not studying. You know that very well. They're not studying. They're not studying.
They're learning patterns in them.
Let me
That's
change
different.
the conversation a little.
I think
So, your paper that got circulated, Art and the Science of Generative AI, Deeper Dive. So I was interested to see Hani Farid's name there. So I don't know if everybody's familiar. He's a computer scientist who's been working to analyze images to see to what degree they have been manipulated or falsified. So now we have this situation where we can consider that most images might be fictional. So how did he have any perspectives about that, or?
I think it's the familiar story of, like, you know, there's techniques you can sometimes use to tell if something's generated, but you can't ever prove it. And there's some cases where you're just never going to know. I don't recall him what he said beyond that, or what we wrote in the paper.
So basically, I mean, you know, because my background is photography, so I came from a field that saw itself transition from where you have a visual record that is considered to this day as a document of proof, even though we know it's not. So there's this tremendous discrepancy between how this particular artifact functions and how the culture misunderstands it. So that's a kind of pretty interesting challenge that we have today in terms of.
Yeah, the deep fakes scary.
Yeah. And Adobe's in the business of, you know, Photoshop. So
Yeah.
what-
And there is an Adobe initiative called Content Authenticity that cryptographically signs pictures so that you can prove that this picture, how the picture's history, but it's definitely not going to, like, tell you this picture I downloaded off the web where it came from.
Any more? Sorry, I just want to add one more thing. Any more from this paper? You have, like, what, 14 people? Any other insights about the paper that you can share with us?
Oh, I mean, well, beyond what's written there, like, you know, it's a big, you know, consortium of a whole lot of people that wrote a bunch of different parts, and it's 4 topics of art and culture, deep fakes, law/copyright, and economics. And so we tried to kind of, like, just put together all these people and tease out what are the key scientific problems that people should be thinking about, and especially because it's published in Science, to frame questions that are important for society that people should be researching, and sort of, like, frame the question in terms of how will these technologies affect society, and not how will these AIRs, you know, work. I think there's a question in the back there.
Even if we cannot predict the future of all these new technologies, as part of a division, as part of a company, there has been some conversation about the future, especially because your clientele primarily are artists, and artists, if you make them obsolete, then no more business, right? So from the business and company perspective, there has to be some prediction about what is going to be the tools of the future. Can you talk to us a little bit about, without, of course, going to the contract, but, like, what are the expected clientele or needs that Adobe sees in the future, and it is moving to B2B as it compliant to more industry or business needs versus individual artists, or do you see any need in the future, or what are the expected tool needs in the future with this new trends?
Well, I can't speak for the company. Like I can give my own opinion. I have no idea what the company would how they'd answer those questions. But from my own point of view, I see. Well, so one thing again is like many different kinds of artists and people who work in different ways. And some people, I think, the sort of people who like use a digital photography algorithm, they want to like, I just want to like make a change over here and just type in that text, and like that can often be a much faster way to do something than manually masking things out. And there's a bunch of machine learning tools already built into these, into things like Photoshop that automate different parts of the process. And so these things can add more expressive capabilities for people with certain kinds of workflows, and for digital marketers as well. I don't know if that answers your question, but there's, I think there are certain the tools that are more integrated into processes, and rather than just type in your text and output an image, that's not super useful, but something that I'm doing a whole bunch of things in an application, and now I just want to delete that person or like add this thing to the sky. Those sorts of things can be very valuable for people who are making pictures. Sorry, I don't know who's next.
Thanks. Yeah, I have a nitpicky comment and a question.
Okay.
The nitpicky comment is that you showed 3 examples of like really early computer art from Germany in the 1960s. They actually did use code. They used Polygonal 60.
Oh, okay.
It was like a very early version of Algorithm. And you can actually look at the code. It's out there. But this is just a nitpicky comment. The question is, so you've very eloquently, thank you so much for that, showed us very convincingly why all the examples that you can see and you can make yourself, why this is effectively not art, and why the computer cannot be an artist, right? But I feel these are the easy questions, right? Because it's easy to kind of like disprove that, it's easy to align that with theories of art that will always give you arguments for making that clear. But I want to ask you, like, if this kind of image making, of which you showed examples, if this is not photography, right, which I think you said it isn't, what is it then? So I'm asking you kind of like for a positive theory of what these techniques of image making are and what they afford, versus saying what they not are, which again, what I think is the easy way out a little bit. And I'm curious to hear your perspective on what it actually is that we're dealing with today.
Well, that's a broad question.
I know.
Yeah. And I think that the question, like, if we look back, like, 10 years from now, we look back and we say, like, what was that thing? The answer is going to be like very nuanced. In this case, of this thing, in this application, is that thing. I get like so. I think it is definitely art. Like I type in text and I make a picture. Of course, that's art. Probably not very good art. It's probably kind of dumb and pedestrian. But the real questions to ask is how does it function? What does it mean to be an artist working in that space? What are instances that are meaningful to people? And so far, like one theme I have in the talk is that like the initial stage of a new technology is people just kicking the tires and playing with a new tool and seeing what it is. And I feel like so much of what we call AI art today is just experimentation. Like most people cannot remember the first 40 years of cinema. Like name one director from before 1940. Like a few of us can do it, but it's not like commonly possible. And I think most of the things that we have as AR today are things that in that category. Really cool and awesome, no one's going to know them 50 years from now. What does that mean when we actually develop it as a tool, if that's your question? I don't know, because that's the whole point of that exploration. I don't know if that's what you're asking.
So like, no matter how you say that like computers aren't human or whatever, right? But in the context of our generation, both humans and machines hold some sort of latent space, right? We have some space. Or there's all the things we've seen, and then we draw connections between our latent space, right? It doesn't really matter, like the morality argument. For the piece of generating art, anyways, like for the example, like is it useful, is it not useful for the pragmatic evidence of art? We both have this like some sort of latent space, right? And then it feels like some latent spaces are more fair than others. Like for example, consider one where your art generator just picks the closest image in its data set to your description. That's plagiarism, right? We all agree that's plagiarism, right? But then like say, doing some sort of finer interpolation between two images, that's still like kind of plagiarism, but it's like less plagiarism, right? But And so it feels like there's like a not well-defined line between what is stealing and what is inspired, if that makes sense.
And sampling a PDF is not plagiarism, so if you create a PDF of it, you can do that.
Yeah, I guess so. And so it feels like for the purposes of attribution, like credit and attribution, like it feels like such a not well-defined problem. And I feel like there needs to be some sort of line. What is considered inspiration and what is considered copying?
So I have lots of thoughts on this topic and the previous discussion on it. For that question, I will point out that this has been a debate for centuries of what is infringement of copyright? There's been a few Supreme Court cases in the past year with Andy Warhol and with Prince photograph, where is it copying or is it plagiarism or is it fair use? And it basically goes all the way to the Supreme Court before, because it's just because there is no precise description in the law as to what is plagiarism and what is fair use or just purely inspiration. And so we have a legal framework, it is ambiguous, and just applying that to our existing system is something that we should be doing. If you generate with an algorithm something which looks very similar to something that was in the training set, then of course it makes sense that that is a derivative work that should be viewed as plagiarism. With caveats, I guess. Beyond that, it's there is a direct analogy between human inspiration and computers. I would not say it's the same thing. It's definitely a very different thing. But you're making something new, and if you put copyright restrictions on making anything new from inspired by existing work, there's a danger of chilling creative expression. That's the chilling effect is the effect of having too much copyright, and we have arguably too much copyright right now in the U.S. But the reason we have copyright is to, in the Constitution it says, in the U.S. Constitution, for the better to encourage arts and culture and technology. I forget the exact phrasing, but the point is it's a pragmatic decision. These decisions about what is restricted and not is about what will benefit arts and culture and balance the needs of artists and society. And so that's the discussion I think we need to be having in the context of these new tools. Does it hurt artists too much or help artists? Because as this Choke Point Capitalism book argues, having too much copyright is actually bad for artists. So figuring out that balance is something that we have to struggle with. I don't know if that...
I mean, I get what you're saying, right? But it feels like, for the sake of copyright, we take a legal framework, right? That the more impactful a work is, the more inspired it should be. For example, say you have someone who just copies someone else's style and posts it on Instagram, right? It's not a direct copy, and maybe I can say it's uninspired, but who cares? It's just someone's Instagram, right? And then maybe for a case of a hit single, a song album or whatever, it's a little more important because now it has big monetary fees, right? But for the sake of AI art, this is more than just a single album or even a song or something like that. It's an entire industry, right? If it's going to be a new thing, if it's going to threaten this entire industry, it should be very, very distinct from that industry. If that makes sense. I think photography was an entirely separate discipline from say painting, right? It feels like there needs to be a big distance for it to be considered different copyrightable entities.
I mean, one of the points I was argued that even though painting and photography seemed very different now, 100 years ago, or however long, 1830s, it felt like this is in direct competition, and a lot of painters did lose work as a result of this technology. So there is a trade-off there.
Well, I'm saying the development of photography and the ways that we make photography better and more competitive than portraits is not based off any of the work that you're doing in portraits. It's not based on any styles of what you do when you paint, right? It feels like the AI industry is built off of another industry and is sort of leeching in some sense. I mean, it feels like a different concept.
Yeah, it does feel different. Yeah.
Thank you for a really informative and encompassing presentation, and also for firing up a nice conversation. We heard a really kind of passionate back and forth between what art does and maybe what art is, meaning maybe there's some text and you read it and it has the same effect as a novel, so what's the difference? And it's easier to make, so we have more novels. Or, Tarantino versus whether he understood or whether he just absorbed everything. I think artists do absorb all sorts of things, and if you stop that, it wouldn't work. But there are some other questions, so you have what art does and what art is, but you could also ask how art does, and you could even ask what I'm really curious about, when art is. And you mentioned Darwin and Dutton and a kind of evolutionary perspective. There's another one by someone named Richard Prum that is called The Evolution of Beauty, and it traces from Darwin, but then goes back and traces the evolution of beauty in birds. Like, because they, like the birds of paradise, do extraordinary things. And so the question is, well, if there's a kind of evolutionary viewpoint, when in the whole sort of history of evolution that goes way beyond the human, way before the human, when would have been the first proto-art gesture by what simple organism? Because we're trying to judge art, in its present form, when in fact it probably arose out of something simpler, but it was still some kind of neural net in the world doing something, and this is a neural net in the world doing something. And what would that be? Like, where do you think, or where do we think, because I'm not trying to put, I'm just thinking myself, like, where is the first spark of art, and can we get our machines to deal with that? Which is maybe much simpler, but then it could evolve to more complex behaviors. What do you think?
Well, so I'm also reading a book on animal intelligence called "Are We Smart Enough to Know How Smart Animals Are?" And they would basically say, any question you have like that, we don't know. Like, when did intelligence form in animals? Well, intelligence means different things to different species, and what did, awareness, like, there's many different concepts, like who knows when that came about in our history. I would definitely say I view a lot of these animal examples of beauty and songbird song as they feel more mechanistic in how they are created and appreciated. Like, it's unclear that there's an aesthetic component to them per se.
Well, it must have arisen sometime. It must have arisen sometime. So basically the question is, okay, eliminate all the ones that are too mechanistic, but at some point they must have gone from being mechanistic to being what we recognize. What is that earliest point? Like, we can't just dismiss the entire question because we don't know the beginning. And in any case, the question is ultimately, what is the simplest version of this AI that can do the simplest version of what we might call art? Again, to retrieve the question to where we can actually answer it, as opposed to dispense with the question because we can't answer it.
Something about that feels a little circular to me, to say when an animal, let's define art in terms of the earliest animal that we call that art, and then have an AI duplicate that. We have to get, like, how do we define art in that context?
Well, yeah, exactly. How do we? Because I think avoiding the question is really the problem. Like, we can't deal with it because we're not being precise enough in our formulation. We're kind of giving up too soon, and so then we can't do anything about it. But the model for me is like chaos theory, when chaos for thousands of years was just chaos. And over the last few decades, sometime in the 70s, 80s, 90s, it became a science. We took this word that was completely mysterious and demystified it and found that there was pattern in chaos and behavior and algorithms and dynamical systems and all sorts of things that arose and became definite when the question sharpened. And we're basically in the Middle Ages or before that, who knows when, regarding art and beauty. We're seeing this thing that looks amorphous to us, we give up. And what we need to do, I think, as I think you and the people you mentioned, and also Adobe and the companies that are doing it, that they're bringing it into some kind of empirical situation where it might be a bad hypothesis or it might be a good hypothesis, but at least you can test it, right? At least you can say, well, I think it's an amoeba, and I think when it does this doodle, that's art. And then you say, okay, that was too simple. Let's bring it up a bit. And now it's back in the realm of what we can do, as opposed to yielding and giving up. That's all.
Oh yeah, there's a lot there. I think. Well, I think. I don't know. I have a lot of thoughts on that, but I'm not sure exactly what's relevant for you.
It's a big question for the end of the day.
Actually, it's a good question to end with. Oh, there's more questions. Let's
if you have time.
If it's better than
easier to know. Well, I also want to thank you for the great talk and very interesting conversation. I'm wondering about the notion of art as this social behavior that you were questioning, or you were bringing up to your discussion, and you were saying that because these are tools, these are machines, that level of social behavior cannot happen, and therefore it's not, it cannot be an art form because we don't experience that type of human social experience. But I want to argue that there is a new environment that this type of generative AI algorithms can create, a new techno-social spaces, new atmosphere of thinking together, co-creating, and getting inspired by these machines. And I think for a lot of us who play with these algorithms and make with these algorithms, we had this experience. And I personally had a lot of experience interacting with these machines, not as a quasi-social interaction, but as a social interaction that actually was impactful in my creative process. So I feel they create this new techno-affective atmosphere that can add to what we can create, to our perception, to even help us with brainstorming or do things that we didn't think about before. And for example, personally, I was affected by this socio-political movement last year that was impacting me deeply. And working with generative AI and creating in this space between what I could create and the way that AI, my generative AI, was responding to me, I felt there was a conversation, there was communication, and there was this very influential, very effective and affective interaction between me and this machine that I don't think this existed before in interactions with different types of tools. So I want to ask you, how do you see this type of new environment? How do you, because for me it's more than just a tool. For me it does more than that. And I'm wondering, how do you think about, for example, the concept of co-creation with AI? How do you think about this new space of creativities that this type of technology defines now?
So I'm sorry if I gave the impression I don't think it's stuff as art. Like, I think all these tools are amazing. These algorithms are amazing tools for artists. Like generative AI, of course it's art. It's just that the algorithm itself is not the artist. And I think that these experiences you're describing are exciting and really valid. That you have this interaction with the algorithm that you never would have had before, and that's what makes this stuff so interesting. That there's new ways to interact with it. And part of thinking about what it is to make art with these things is a new kind of interaction that didn't exist before. When I think people use the term co-creation, to me, that I get a little uncomfortable with that because it implies equal authorship, equal ownership. When you are the one turning on the computer, say, okay, we're doing this now. Co-creation and co-authorship is really usually implies equal status in terms of like, okay, if I don't agree with you, we're going to have to debate about like, what do we want to do in this thing? And like, you and me are both co-authors of this thing that are working together, as opposed to you are starting up a piece of an algorithm and telling what to do and being inspired by it and interacting with it, having this response, this experience through this interaction. But in the end, you're still the one calling the shots.
Yeah, but it doesn't need to be equal authorship. There are all these teams.
Yeah, I mean, that's fine, as long as it doesn't give, I just worry about terms like, quote, artificial intelligence and computational creativity that could be interpreted or could support the idea of these things having equal intelligence. That's just the thing that I want to avoid misleading people about. If you understand co-creation in that sense of like, you're the artist using this tool and have this whole interaction with this system, I think it's totally cool.
Okay, a little bit of disagreement there, but yeah. I think there are different levels of co-creating, but sure, I understand what you're saying, who takes the decision at a point, but there are different levels of agency, I think, in co-creation. And in a lot of teams, we all have our own contributions, and also depends on the discipline. we have teams of artists in a theater group, and there is a team that they create together, and so an actor in a team, or a designer, or a playwright, or a director, they all have their own roles, and they have different types of contribution. And so in these things, because you are the one who have this, who get the final say as a director, that doesn't mean that it doesn't take away from the authorship of other creators in that that artistic form. So I don't know. I agree. It's a complex conversation, and we can look at it from different directions. But yeah, these are different views.
I've had a similar experience in terms of co-writing with a language model as a completion engine. But the thing that I wanted to go into was models like following along the social aspect of the AI as a creative entity. Models like Lava and Bing Generative Vision that produce images based on a text conversation you have with the AI. You talk with the AI, it analyzes the old images it has created, and it talks with you about what changes in the next image. And that is literally, in a sense, a social interaction because it's designed as a chat interaction with the AI. And that feels like a different level of authorship even than a co-creative process of working with the algorithm, or a co-creative process of using that autocomplete to explore the possibility space of your own writing. And I'm wondering if you had commentary on these models that have image and text output.
Yeah, I agree. It feels different. It's a different level of agency. I think it's still you using some code, but you're interacting with it a really different way. And it feels like it's not a very expressive way to make art on its own necessarily, or it's like it's a fun novelty. But it's an interesting interaction. And that's it.
Regardless of all the fundamental questions, as students, we are going into an industry that will have this as a tool one way or another. As a current researcher and developer, what do you see are the fundamental blocks of knowledge that we should strive for as we prepare our skill set towards industry or academia? Because this sort of reminds me when there was a frenzy of Microsoft Office, and before that the computers, and then before that typewriting. With this new wave of technologies, there's an unspoken question about, do we learn everyone how to do models, or do we just use them in our daily lives? Like, what is the level of understanding that we need? And I think this is a concern for a lot of the students and peers. What do you think should be a good level of, or building blocks, essentially, or skill blocks?
Yeah, I don't have a great concrete answer to that question. I definitely think, like back when I worked at Pixar many years ago, what I heard, and this may not be still be true, but people would apply to Pixar saying, what software tools should I learn in order to apply to work at Pixar, or which animation packages? And the answer was, it doesn't matter. We'll teach you how to use our packages. What you should know how to do is how to draw and animate, and how to express personality through motion. And so I think, to some extent, there are certain kinds of artistic intuitions and skills that you learn that transfer across different media. And so being able to judge what is the meaning of this picture, and how do I explore, and having intuitions for, this thing I'm doing is interesting and this thing is not interesting. Those sorts of intuitions I think are really important to develop in any medium. In terms of what technology, definitely don't get locked into any one specific technology. Learn, skills that you can update and evolve, and keep track of things when they're going on, so that you're not locked into this thing which isn't going to exist 5 years from now. I'm sorry, I don't have a more concrete answer than that, which is that's the high level answer I would give.
Such an interesting topic.
Thank you for the great talk. So I have a question about how do you think the machine can do a better job of learning the current human creations? Because if you look at the history, I think the machine learning training model is kind of trained on the reduced information, like the image processed through is reduced to 28 pixels, but it's becoming better, right? Stable diffusion, you can generate really complex images the GAN. So I'm thinking what's your prediction on the next development of this kind of learning to be able to learn more about human fireworks. Because we don't want to just learn on the reduced information. We want to learn like the very uniqueness of each artwork.
I don't think I have a good answer for that. I think right now a lot of the developments are just in the exploitation of these current techniques and generalizing them for different artistic tool applications and multimodal data sets of like different sources of information being combined. Beyond that, I don't have a good prediction. Sorry. Okay. All right. Well, thank you.
Thanks.